Hey, hello everyone. Happy to see some names here that I recognize. I'm just going to jump right in and introduce Dr. Katie Young from Kentucky Equine Research, and this should be a very interesting webinar. And please, anyone who wants to ask a question, just go up to the Q&A bubble at the top, and hopefully you can get into it because I did have some people at the last webinar say they were struggling to get in. I have a feeling that maybe some areas that have maybe it's poor internet connection that's causing some people not to be even able to get on. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Young.
Okay, and let me share my screen. And then move this window and start the slideshow.
Good.
Excellent. So then here's the next big thing. Do the slides advance? Yay! Okay.
We like it when
Knock on wood.
technology works.
Technology is our friend when it works. Okay, so my introductory slide. If you haven't been on one of these webinars before, this is just me. I'm an equine nutritionist, and I'm a consulting equine nutritionist with Kentucky Equine Research. A little bit about my background. I got my BS from Missouri State and majored in biology and minored in animal science and chemistry, and almost got a minor in business as well, as I was jumping around trying to decide what I was going to be when I grew up. Because, of course, as most nutritionists, I was going to be a veterinarian, and then said, I don't think I want to do that after all. So I ended up going to graduate school at Texas A&M and earned my PhD in equine nutrition and exercise physiology. And then I stayed on at A&M for a few years on the faculty of the horse section and taught undergraduate equine classes, and that was a great deal of fun. But my major professor thought that I really needed to get out in the world and become a more permanent member of the equine community. And so I originally was planning to go into extension, but I ended up with a job at Farmland Industries as the equine nutritionist and ended up as a horse feed program manager, which was very similar to a job in extension, but in industry, because I was working on formulating feeds, but also did a lot of education, because in the feed industry, the the feeling really is that as horse owners become more educated, when you're working with quality feed, the more educated horse owner understands why a good quality feed is important. And so as an equine nutritionist, that's always been one of my roles, is to help educate horse owners on the nutritional needs of their horses, whatever the class of horse they own or ride or breed or whatever you do with your horse. So I did that with Farmland for several years, and then unfortunately Farmland went bankrupt. And at that point, I live in the Kansas City area, and I was not willing to move. And there are not very many feed companies that make horse feed in the Kansas City area, which actually is none. So I went independent and became a consultant. And the first company I started working for as a consultant was the US Purina. And I was a consultant for several years. And then I was hired and worked for Purina and was the technical nutritionist in charge of formulation, but also still did a lot of education, working with horse owners and salespeople and Purina dealers. And then several years ago, we parted ways, and I have known Dr. Joe Pagan, who is the owner and founder of Kentucky Equine Research. And I have known Joe for several decades, and I've always thought the world of him and what he does with Kentucky Equine Research. And we started talking and realized that there was a nice fit with my skill set and Kentucky Equine Research. So I have been with KER now since that time. And it's again been a very nice collaboration. And I do quite a bit of work for KER, once again, in helping to educate horse owners and working with some of the KER business partners who are feed manufacturers in helping with the things I've been doing throughout my career. So that is my my background in industry and academia. And I also, of course, have a huge background, as most equine nutritionists do, just with horses, because I started out as a typical horse crazy kid and got to start riding horses when I was about 11 and got my first horse when I was 12. Rode Western for quite a few years, and then when I went to Missouri State and had a chance to take some horse classes, and I'd been riding Western and barrel racing for years, and said, I'm going to try something new. And I took lessons in jumping and just fell in love and really haven't looked back. So these are some of my horses. You can see the Palomino Appaloosa. I did hunter, jumper, and equitation for several decades, and then as I kind of got broken and I have kind of some bad knees and bad back and my eyes aren't as great, so made the logical transition from hunter jumper to eventing. So that's more of what I do now, although I'm kind of getting to the point where those solid cross-country jumps that don't fall down aren't so appealing anymore. So I'm actually doing more dressage now than I used to. But my Palomino Appy is mostly retired. He's going to be 25 this year. And the guy in the middle with the really cute jump was my old man that I lost last year at the age of 37 and a half. And that the picture in the middle of the bottom there, that is still Boo. And that was a lesson he gave during his last year of life. So I had a 37-year-old riding horse. He was still sound. He was happy until he gave a lesson the day before he passed away, went out in the pasture and went to sleep and didn't wake up. So I do know a lot about feeding old horses, and Sweet Boo also was flaming PPID. So I've learned a lot about feeding PPID horses as well. We talked about that some in some of our previous webinars. But anyhow, so that is I should say that was Boo, Sweet Boo. And then now my main ride is a 17-hand Trakehner that I started riding when he was 4. And now he's 9, so much more of a solid citizen, and I'm not afraid of dying, which is happy. And just the picture there by Missouri State, I did spend a very lovely 7 years as the nutritionist for the Budweiser Clydesdales. So that was great fun. I learned a whole lot during that time about working with and feeding draft horses, because there's a lot of things about draft horses that are somewhat different, but then again, not as different as a lot of people think. So if you ever have draft horse questions, I have a lot of fun with that too. But tonight we're going to be talking about broodmares and babies. And I could spend hours and hours. So some of these things I'm going to kind of fly through and just touch on, because really this could be easily 2 separate webinars, but we're putting it into one. So I'm going to start with broodmares, but to some extent there's an overlap, because when you feed the mare for a certain amount of time during gestation and during lactation, you are also feeding the baby. So the requirements for the mare, if you look at it in different stages, you got to feed through conception and early pregnancy. Then mid-gestation, the requirements change a bit. Late gestation, they change more. During lactation, they change a great deal. And then after weaning, I'm kind of through weaning, but after weaning, they change again. However, there's some muddling, because a lot of brood mares, when that's what they do for a living, they can be lactating and be pregnant. So we got lots of things to keep in mind when we're feeding the brood mares. Now, the growing horses, we've got the stages here. We've got the suckling. So this is the baby is still on mama, and we do need to feed that suckling, and we need to feed the weanling. And there are some differences then when you get into yearlings and 2-year-olds, but at that point we are starting, especially 2-year-olds, we're also starting to think about performance horses. So for tonight, I have left the yearlings and 2-year-olds off because, again, we just don't have that much time, and I don't want to keep you all until midnight, even though I could probably, well, with my voice today, I might not be able to keep talking, but most days I could be talking till midnight. So nutrient requirements. In general, for all, well, not even in general, for all horses, there are necessary nutrients in the diet. The first nutrient is water. You've got to meet a horse's water requirement. For the most part, it is offering clean, fresh water pretty much whenever they want it. And the importance of water is because the body is about 70% water, and that water is in constant turnover. So water not only is excreted through urine and feces, but there's also water lost in sweat. There's water lost in respiration. So there's always water being lost. And when we're talking about mares, there's also water that goes into the milk. So we have to be aware that there's this turnover of water, and you always have to be making sure that the horse is getting its water requirement met. And then this is my own word I just made up. It's probably somebody else has used it, but the feedable nutrients. So these are the nutrients the horse is going to eat, which is going to be the protein, carbohydrates, fat, and then vitamins and minerals. So proteins are the amino acids and proteins are used for building body tissue, which would be muscle, skeleton, and then since we're talking about broodmares and babies, we also have to think about the fetus and placenta. So as you're feeding the mare, you've got to be feeding the nutrients to help the growing fetus, and also the placenta, the organ that is supplying the fetus and protecting the fetus. So with the mare, you've got to be providing the nutrients for all of these needs. Then carbohydrates, and people usually just think about carbohydrates, and in our last webinar, we really went into carbs, but you got to keep in mind carbohydrates are the major source of energy for a horse, and carbs includes fibers, which predominantly come from the forage in the horse's diet, and then non-structural carbohydrates, which are going to come to some extent from the forages, but also the grains in the feeds that are fed to a horse are good sources of non-structural carbs. Fat is another necessary nutrient. Fat is important for cellular integrity and as an energy source, and fat can be saved as in the body as a storage form of energy. And then, of course, minerals and vitamins. And those, we're not even going to go into all the functions because hundreds of functions, I guess thousands of functions in the body. They're part of structures. They're part of enzymes. They're just everywhere. So, and again, we're going to talk about some of the minerals and some of the vitamins, but there are numerous vitamins and minerals that are required in a horse's diet. We don't have time to get into every one, but I will certainly talk about the important ones to be considering when you're feeding broodmares and babies. And then I put in their energy, because energy is actually not a nutrient, but energy is a nutrient requirement. I think that was actually, that may have even been a question in my graduate exams. And I've had disagreements with nutritionists as, is energy a nutrient or not? And this is my own description. It's not a nutrient, but there is a nutrient requirement for energy. And that requirement is actually met with carbs, fats, and when there's an excess of protein, protein can be broken down and used as an energy source. So it's a nutrient requirement, but energy is not a nutrient itself, and energy is measured in calories. So when you talk about the calories in the feed, or as a human, the calories in the food. That is a measurement of energy. Okay, and my slides have now. I'm going to stop sharing and then go back in because my slides froze. Did we unfreeze? No, we didn't unfreeze. So I'm going to have to escape and then put it back on slideshow. Lori, we jinxed it when we said the technical was working. There, but we're back. Yay. So let's dive now into broodmare nutrition. And here's our really pretty little picture of all these nice broodmares. And man, look at all those grays. It's been raining here in Kansas all day. And I guarantee if that was a batch of broodmares in Kansas, not a one of them would be gray anymore. They would all be mud done. But nutrient requirements of broodmares. The nutrients and the energy in a broodmare are needed for, first off, maintenance of the mare. You got to meet the mare's basic nutrient requirements for maintenance. But then on top of that, you've got to make sure in her diet, you are providing nutrients and energy for deposition of fetal and placental tissue, for the hypertrophy of the uterus. As the uterus is getting bigger, as the fetus is growing, you got to provide nutrients to support that. You've got to provide nutrients excuse me, to support mammary development so that when that baby is ready to be weaned, that mare is ready to lactate and feed that baby. And during pregnancy, you have to provide nutrients for maintenance and the growth of the fetus, the placenta, the mammary, and the additional uterine tissue. And as I mentioned before, keep in mind too that these mares, once they start lactating, you may be feeding them to support the next pregnancy as well. And then the demands of milk production, which milk production is tough on a mare. That sucks out a whole lot of nutrients. So the first thing, and if you've ever been to one of my webinars or just about any webinar that a nutritionist gives, they're going to talk about body condition scoring, because it is so important on all horses to know how to body condition score that horse, because that is your tool to determine if the horse is actually getting enough calories in its diet to support all these needs. And with a mare, especially a lactating mare, energy is probably the most difficult nutritional requirement to supply, because she is using so many calories in supporting that baby. Body fat is stored energy, and body condition actually refers to the amount of fat cover. There are people who get kind of confused and think body condition also has to do with the muscle fitness. It does not at all. It is just the amount of fat that horse is storing. And that stored energy, the body fat, can influence both the health of the mare and the developing fetus. So the body condition score is a system that was developed back in the 80s, late 80s, I believe, by Don Henneke at Texas A&M. And it's a fairly objective way to determine whether the horse is fat or thin or moderate. And in general, we want to have horses at a moderate level of body condition. The Henneke scale runs from 1 to 9. 1 is emaciated, 5 is usually about ideal, and 9 is extremely obese. We certainly don't want to have horses emaciated, and we also don't want to have horses obese, because there's nothing good that comes of that, and you can run into all sorts of metabolic problems. So we want them right in the middle. So for a broodmare, and I'll talk about this, for a broodmare, we do want to see them a little bit more on the fleshy side. So we want to see them about 5 to 6, 6.5. When you get over a body condition score of 7, then we start seeing more problems with metabolic issues. But to do a body condition scoring, you look at the places where the horse stores fat. And horses are not like humans. They are like humans in that we all store fat in different places. Some people store fat around their belly, some people store fat in their bottom half. It's all individual, and to some extent, it's determined by genetics. Horses are the same way, but they store fat in different places than humans. They store fat along their neck, along the crest of their neck, over their withers, over their back, right along the spine, at the tail head, over their ribs, and behind the shoulders. So when you're evaluating body condition score, those are the places you evaluate the fat, and you get in there and you put your hands on it. You feel how much fat cover. And again, it's an excellent tool to learn, because when you're looking at brood mares, you don't want to see a brood mare like the one in the middle or the one on the left. Those are brood mares that have used up all their body fat stores, usually to support the baby. And in this case, these are pregnant mares, so they're supporting the growing baby. On the other hand, you don't want an obese brood mare because, again, metabolic problems. So this is the body condition score chart. It is available at KER.com, but it's something I recommend you to grab a body condition score chart and get familiar. And of course, if you're a customer of Brooks, Lori can help you with giving you more information and help you figure out where to look, where to feel. But it's a very important tool. And you use it for brood mares, you use it for performance horses, you use it for growing horses, you use it for maintenance horses. It's a really good way to take fat is in the eye of the beholder. There are a lot of disciplines in that fat horses look good, but fat horses are not healthy. And when you're growing babies, skinny horses are very much not healthy. So again, the ideal body condition score for brood mares, moderate to fleshy condition, a body condition score 5 to 7. 7 would be the max. Don't let them get over that. What they've seen in research, that mares that are maintaining a little bit more fleshy condition, they will cycle earlier in the year. They require fewer cycles per conception. They have a higher pregnancy rate, and they're more likely to maintain pregnancy than thin mares. And actually, a lot of this was research originally. That's what Don Hanneke was working on when he developed the body condition scoring system. Mares that have higher body condition may be more resilient to weight loss in the 3rd trimester and also better able to fight infections. Thin brood mares have a tendency to have more problems. So again, excuse me, I'm going to take a little swig of water here. You want to watch that mare. Make sure that she is maintaining her body condition and catch it early. If you need to increase her feeding amount to make sure she's not losing weight, you want to be able to do that. And research actually has shown that a thin mare who is gaining weight is better able to maintain pregnancy than a thin mare or a moderate mare that is losing weight. So again, be very observant of your mare's body condition. Now, on the other hand, overweight mares, overnutrition of the mare in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy results in altered glucose tolerance of the mare in foal. So when you start getting really fat mares, you can already start running into metabolic issues. And Josie Coverdale saw in 2015, her research, she saw greater concentrations of insulin are required to maintain similar blood glucose concentrations in the mare and may allow for metabolic programming in the foal. And a foal is more likely to become obese as an adult and or insulin resistant when its mare, its dam, was obese and had issues with insulin during the 3rd trimester. So again, be aware of body condition scoring. Obesity in gestational mare can also limit fetal growth because of the size constraint. And you could possibly have complications at parturition, dystocia, which is, problems in giving birth. Now, usually that takes we're talking body condition score 8 to 9, because in some other research, they really didn't see any problems with dystocia in overly fat mares, but still it is something to keep keep in the back of your mind. And overfeeding the mare energy, or 120% of NRC calorie requirements, resulted in research in reduced IgG concentrations in colostrum. Did not result in failure of passive transfer, so it did not affect the immunity status of the foal, but the mare nutrition does influence colostrum quality. So it's, again, something to keep in mind, just not an ideal situation. On the other hand, underweight mares, thin mares will use their own body stores to nourish fetus. That is the thing with brood mares' bodies. The mare's body will sacrifice its own nutrition to supply and protect the fetus. And it can become excessive very quickly, body fat and body muscle loss. If the mare is not getting adequate calories and adequate protein to support the growth of the fetus, again, she'll pull it out of her own body. It'll go quickly. And it is more difficult to maintain body condition with lactation when the mare is underweight. Again, it's interesting, in dairy cattle, you're used to seeing those dairy cows that are almost skeletal, and it's considered high quality, it's a high quality dairy cow, but we don't want to see that in mares. We don't want to see them sacrifice their own condition to support the fetus. Henneke did see that mares in lower body condition have lower conception rates, and thin foaling mares had longer intervals from partum to postpartum estrus, so it took them longer to start coming back into heat. And mares with a body condition score less than 5 are more likely to skip a breeding season. So if you are breeding mares for a living, you don't want to miss a breeding season just because the mare was thin. You've got to feed them for maximum efficiency and healthy growth of the baby. Mares with restricted diets in late gestation lose body condition more rapidly than other horses, as from Hines in 1987. And again, in late gestation, there's a lot of draw for the growth of the fetus, so it makes sense that they would lose weight easily, especially with a restricted diet. And mares fed energy deficient diets tend to have longer gestations than those fed energy sufficient. Once again, how do you tell if the mare is being fed an energy sufficient diet? Body condition scoring. So what is your normal weight gain expectation in brood mares? The gestational weight gain, about 12 to 16% of the mare's initial body weight. And most of the weight gain is from the growth of the fetus and placental tissues. And you can see from this chart, the percent of birth weight of the fetus during the first trimester of pregnancy, that fetus is very small. And it really doesn't start picking up growth until about month 4 to 5. And you can see by that curve, by about month 5, then the growth rate of the fetus becomes pretty exponential. So the last trimester, that fetus is just a little growing machine. So more than 40% of fetal weight gain occurs before the 9th month, but it says less than 60% occurs during the 9th to 11th month, but still, during that last trimester, the fetus is growing about half a kilo or a pound a day. So that is a lot of growth going on that, again, you've got to feed the mare to support that growth. And of course, excessive or inadequate weight gain should be monitored. Stress also can affect conception rates. Stress comes from a lot of things other than nutrition. So I just threw in the common stresses: transport, medication administration, cold and heat stress, individual housing, and the phase of the reproductive cycle. All of those are typical stresses for horses. However, for brood mares, some horses can be stressed if either their meal times or amount of forage is limited. So the nutrition-related stress is manifested in horses as the emergence of the oral type stereotypies, abnormal behaviors, and gastric ulcers. And if you think about in breeding facilities, mares are often housed individually with extra exposure to light to advance the breeding season. We can control estrus to some extent in mares with the photo period. So for instance, if you want the mare to start cycling early or manage her cycles, because mares do tend to stop cycling over the winter. So a lot of mares are under lights to manage that. And so if they're individual, they're housed individually, they have extra light, they may only be fed 1 to 2 meals daily rather than having access to forage throughout the day as they would while they were on pasture. So these are horses that may be stressed. And researchers have found that that can affect conception rates. They found that brood mares fed roughage day and night had significantly fewer estrus cycle abnormalities and significantly higher conception rates compared to brood mares offered roughage only at night. And that's even though both groups were offered about the same total amount of roughage over 24 hours. So the thought there is that stress of just having the meals and the limited forage or roughage available, that stress affected their conception rates. So again, something to keep in mind when you're feeding your brood mares. Okay, let's separate out the different stages of the brood mare's nutritional needs. So we're going to start with the gestation, and we're going to go through first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester of gestation. During the first trimester, remember that fetus it's growing, but very, very slowly. It's a tiny little fetus there in the uterus. So the nutrient requirement equals the mare's needs for maintenance plus the nutrient needs for the developing fetus and the placental tissues. So again, early gestational mare is very similar nutrient requirements to maintenance because the fetus is very tiny. And good quality forage can typically cover requirements for energy and possibly protein. But if it's protein you're looking for, it needs to be very, very good quality forage. And green pasture is a very good quality protein, and typically for early gestation can provide amino acids. But personally, I still recommend for an easy enough keeper that is maintaining body weight and body condition on forage alone, a ration balancer to make sure that they are getting adequate. They're not needing the energy because they're getting that from the forage, but a ration balancer will provide the protein and vitamins and minerals. Hard keepers will likely need a concentrate feed. Even if your horse is a hard keeper and needs some concentrate feed at maintenance to maintain adequate body condition, then of course your mare, when she's pregnant, is going to need concentrate feed, even with the good quality forage. Forage alone can't meet the mineral requirements of gestating mares, even when it's good quality forage. Forages are consistently found to be low in copper and zinc, and forages are selenium and iodine deficient in many areas of the country. Vitamins A and E. The vitamin A and E requirements increase throughout pregnancy, and while fresh green forage can cover requirements early in that first trimester, conserved forages or dry forages, such as hay, will likely need supplementation. And I say will most likely need supplementation. And again, ration balancers That's for an easy keeper. A ration balancer is my first go-to. Then a vitamin mineral supplement. A vitamin mineral supplement would take care of vitamins and minerals, but I would always like to see a little bit more protein. I'd sure rather see a little excess of protein than have a pregnant mare who's not getting all the amino acids she needs. Or again, for a horse that's a little harder keeper and needs more calories, a concentrate feed. And there are a lot of good concentrate feeds that are designed for brood mares, and actually most of the broodmare feeds are also appropriate for the young growing horse. So it's kind of nice to have one feed that will fit all those situations. If the mare is lactating, the increase in feed intake should cover requirements for both lactation and the growing fetus. And I put lactation in here because, again, we can have brood mares that are in the first trimester of their next pregnancy while they've got a baby who is, still nursing from the previous year's pregnancy. But in that case, if you're feeding a lactating mare, your feed intake is going to be high enough that it should cover requirements for both lactation and the growing fetus in her next, first trimester of pregnancy. And this is to just show for an easy keeper that's getting adequate calories just from the forage alone, that adding a ration balancer will then provide the nutrients to meet the requirements. And this is from Kentucky Equine Research's microsteed ration evaluation program. And so the green is the nutrition coming from the forage, and then the red is nutrition coming from a ration balancer pellet, which in this case, 1 kilo, that's about 2 pounds a day of the ration balancer pellet, and about 10 to 15 pounds or 5 to 7.5 kilos of grass hay. And the one thing that I don't have here is the yellow. You notice that you needed yellow in those 2 bars for sodium and chloride. And that is why for all horses, it's a good idea to at least have some salt available, free choice. Hays tend to be marginal to sometimes deficient in sodium. And if you put enough salt in a feed to meet the horse's requirement, often the horse doesn't really want to eat that feed. So, but they will lick a salt block. Go figure, horses, we will never understand them. But that's just to show that the nutrients from your good quality hay or pasture, along with 1 to 2 pounds or about 1 kilo of ration balancer, will then meet the needs of a mare in early gestation. Now, moving on to the second trimester. The mid-gestational mare has small increases in nutrient requirements compared to the maintenance horse because there's more fetal development going on at this time. You've got increases in energy, protein, lysine, calcium, and phosphorus, again, to support the fetal growth. Good quality forage can cover requirements for energy in a mid-gestational mare, especially if she's an easy keeper, possibly protein for some mares, but again, supplementation with ration balancers recommended for the increases in protein and the mineral requirements, and especially if the mare is on hay, then you want the vitamins from the ration balancer. And if it's a lower quality forage or a higher needs mare, a harder keeper mare, you may need more calories from concentrate feeds or grains. And there are still a lot of people who like to feed straight grains to their horses, but keep in mind, grains alone are not a balanced feed. They don't have the amino acids, and they don't have the vitamins, and they don't have some of the minerals, and some of the minerals are very out of balance. So if you want to feed straight grains, then again, you want to add a ration balancer to help balance out the nutrients in the straight grains. If the mare is still lactating, the increase again in feed intake should cover requirements for both lactation and the growing fetus at this stage of development during the second trimester. Now in the third trimester, remember we've got fetal growth that is just exponential. That fetus is just going to town at this point. So the fetal plus placenta weight gain equals a significant increase in nutrient requirements. And those increased requirements can be met with good quality forage and fortified feed, a commercial concentrate formulated for broodmares, and again, most growth feeds are formulated for broodmares and growing horses. There are still some overweight mares, some very, very easy keepers that you're going, they're still getting enough calories from their forages, but in this situation, you absolutely need a ration balancer then to support the fetal nutrient needs. Mares fed dried or lesser quality forages, sometimes kind of poor quality pastures, will need special attention paid again to supply adequate nutrients, particularly vitamins. And there's significant increases in mineral requirements during this third trimester. For one thing, the fetal liver mineral reserves are being supplied by the mare. There have been several research studies that indicate calcium, phosphorus, copper, and iodine. All, it's very important that the mare is getting adequate minerals because the fetus is using those minerals and they are storing some of the minerals in the fetal liver. Late gestation mares supplemented with copper had foals with lower incidence of fasciitis and OCD than copper deficient mares. There were some studies looking at feeding minerals, particularly the copper requirements of foals, thinking that that might have something to do with OCD and fasciitis in these young growing horses. And what they found was that it was more important to make sure that the mare in that that third trimester had adequate mineral supplementation so that the babies were born with the mineral stores in their liver. And again, particularly copper. Feeding excess energy in late gestation does actually not increase full birth weight. And that was a thought that if you fed a lot of calories, you were going to have bigger fetuses, and that would cause problems. But actually, you have more problems with feeding more calories and the mare getting fat. And actually, that fat kind of leaves less space for the uterus and the uterine environment. So that's more of a problem than actually the baby getting too big because of the calories in the mare's feed. One thing to think about, especially in this last trimester, forages to avoid in brood mares. And number one is endophyte infested tall fescue, because that endophyte that tends to be present in tall fescue does cause abortion and other problems in brood mares. And you can also have high endophyte in ryegrass. You can also have ergot infested grain. So all of these things can cause abortion and other problems in brood mares. So you definitely want to be aware and avoid during the third trimester. And then some other things, high nitrate forages can be an issue. Moldy feeds, mycotoxins, especially zearalenone. Sometimes that's a hard one for me to get out. And there are people who are concerned about alfalfa and other legumes, ad lib and dry and pregnant mares. For the most part, that's an issue of caloric density. Be aware of, alfalfa and legumes tend to be higher calorie forages. So just be aware of that when you're feeding. There are some that are concerned about phytoestrogens now in the legumes. In horses, phytoestrogens haven't been shown to really be a concern, but that is out there. And so for the most part, it's really more that the caloric density of legumes is higher than other ingredients and other forages. And then some special things to think about during the last month before foaling. Mares tend to cut down their feed intake by about 10 to 30%. And one of the reasons is because this uterine environment is taking up so much room in their abdomen. And so that's a problem. Just their desire to eat may be reduced, and their digestibility of the feed is also reduced by about 5%. And there's only about 2% of body weight increase that takes place that last month before foaling. But all that goes together to make you think about the quality of the feed. If your mare is eating less, the digestibility is going down, and she's heading into lactation where nutrient needs just peak. So you got to make sure that the quality of the feed is very high quality, that is meeting all the nutrient requirements. And then as protein requirements increase, as we're reaching parturition, this is a good time to offer more alfalfa hay if pasture quality or quantity is restricted, because alfalfa does tend to be higher in protein content, higher in some minerals than grass hay, and it's more calorie dense. So if the horse is eating less, having something that is more nutrient dense can be helpful. And so for forages, alfalfa is a more nutrient dense forage. And then think about the adjustment to the diet to be fed after foaling, because you don't want to get to parturition and the mare's going into lactation and these high nutrient needs, and you're going, oh, I need to change her feeding program now, because she's already dealing with a great deal of change, and changing the feeding program at the same time is probably not ideal. So you want to be adjusting the diet during that last month so that when she hits parturition and lactation and she's got a baby on the ground to feed, she's already pretty much at the diet that's going to take her then through lactation. And again, you want to avoid fescue, because that endophyte that tall fescue tends to have is going to be a problem at that point. So you want to adjust your concentrate to forage supply in this late pregnancy. Again, if it's a very easy keeper, still ration balancer, and there are still mares that are on ration balancer all the way through, or the suitable concentrate. So at this point, late pregnancy going into early lactation, we tend to be looking at higher protein concentrates, concentrated calories, and the vitamins and minerals, again, to support the late pregnancy and lactation. Extra trace minerals, copper, zinc, manganese are vital to build the liver stores in the foal. We talked a little bit about that, especially the copper. A well-formulated feed for brood mares and growing horses are going to supply, those feeds will supply those minerals when they are fed as recommended. Vitamin E is going to be very important, and green grass is a good source of vitamin E. Hay, dried forage, is not a good source of vitamin E. And then selenium may be helpful to boost immune transfer. So I've got a picture here of KER's Nano E, which is an excellent source of supplemental vitamin E. It's aqueous, natural vitamin E, and that is the most bioavailable form of vitamin E that you can feed to a horse. And then vitamin A again, green grass is an excellent source of vitamin A, or a supplement. And typically vitamin A in a mare and foal feed or in a ration balancer is going to be adequate to support foal growth. And then omega-3 fatty acids. Green grass, again, is an excellent source of omega-3 fatty acids. But if they're not on green grass, then a fish oil supplement, and finding a palatable fish oil supplement sometimes is difficult. And luckily, Kentucky Equine Research has EO3, which is a very palatable fish oil supplement with a very nice amount of bioactive omega-3s, the DHA and the EPA, to support late pregnancy for the mare and the foal. And now we get to lactation. We got a foal on the ground. So we now have to feed to support, again, the mare's needs, which mare's maintenance needs, and we must support milk production. And these mares are milking machines. So we got to make sure we give her all the nutrients that she's going to be putting into the milk. And we got to put the nutrients to go into the milk to support the foal growth and development. And in most of these broodmares, we also want to feed to support rebreeding. So we've got to have her ready so that we want, again, fewer cycles to conception, so we can get her bred again, so we can maintain a good breeding program and, of course, still have healthy mare, healthy foals. The first milk contains the colostrum. And colostrum is so important because that's the first passive immunity that baby is going to have, because the baby's own immune system is not, at this point, when it's first born, baby's immune system is not up and running and making antibodies, or, it's not ready to deal with any kind of antigens. So you want to make sure that the colostrum has got all the immune support that baby's going to need, and nutrients can have effects on colostrum IgG concentration. In research, there's several research studies that have shown all sorts of interesting things in affecting the IgG concentration in colostrum. Number one, natural vitamin E supplementation improved IgG and colostrum in serum concentrations in newborn foals. The marine source DHA supplementation, such as the DHA in the KER EO3 fish oil, increased IgG concentration compared to corn oil. Full serum copper levels positively correlated with IgG levels in colostrum. Selenium supplementation above the requirement increased IgG in selenium deficient zones in one study, but not in a more recent study. So this is something that's interesting, but we do know we want to make sure that the diet contains adequate selenium to meet the requirements, because there are a lot of areas that are selenium deficient, and so those forages from those soils are going to be selenium deficient. And then feeding, and research study, feeding a high-fat fiber feed resulted in higher colostrum IgG. So here are all these different things we've seen that can affect IgG concentration in the colostrum, which again will have an effect on the foal's the passive immunity that they get from the colostrum. And milk production in lactating mares. Lactation is the most nutritionally demanding period for any horse. An average mare produces 12 liters of milk daily, which is about 2% of her body weight. High-producing mares can produce as much as 16 liters of milk daily, or 3% of body weight. The average for the first 22 days is 13.5 liters per day, and production peaks at about 30 days and declines from there on. So that first 30 days, we got to feed that mare to support her milk production. And the quantity of milk produced is influenced by the feeding level. Feeding more calories produce more milk. So while we don't want to provide so many calories that we're producing an overly fat mare, again, the importance of body condition scoring, we want to provide adequate calories for her to produce more milk to support her young growing foal. Again, the nutrient content of the milk has a dramatic decline over time. By 4 months, the milk is only going to provide less than 30% of the total energy requirement of the foal. So the mare's milk starts out very high in nutrition, high in quantity and high in quality. And then it peaks, and then it starts really dropping off. A high-fat diet with quality protein can slow that downward curve of production and improve the nutrient content of milk. So again, we want to be thinking about what we're feeding that mare to support this milk production for as long as we can with the baby. The requirements of lactation from the 3rd trimester of gestation, the mare requires 65% more protein, 44% more energy, so about half again more energy over 3rd trimester gestation, but that's actually about double the energy of maintenance. So this mare, this early lactating mare, is just needing a lot of calories, a lot of protein, and then 55% more calcium and 28% more phosphorus over the 3rd trimester, because again, it's all going into the milk, and that milk is supplying the baby's nutrient requirements. If the mare's nutrient requirements are not being met with the diet, she's going to pull from her own body. She's going to be pulling calories from her body. She's going to be pulling protein from her body, which the stores of protein is muscle. So she's going to be pulling from her own muscle mass. And the calcium and phosphorus, especially the calcium stores in the mare's body, is from the bone. So we don't want the mare pulling from her own body stores. We want her being fed those nutrients to provide the nutrients in the milk. A lactating mare consumes 2 to 3.5% of her body weight per day on a dry matter basis. That means a 500 kilo mare or 1,100 pound, that's 10 to 18 kilos or 22 to 40 pounds of forage plus concentrate. That's a lot of forage and concentrate. So again, we want to be aware of that so we're not shorting the mare on nutrition. And the energy requirement, again, is significantly higher than gestation. So it's about half again as much from the 3rd trimester and double maintenance. So lots of feed going into these mares. Again, lactation causes a 65% increase in protein needs. So the total diet for the lactating mare should be at least 12% protein, and that's forage plus concentrate. Forage, a 12% protein forage is a really high quality grass hay. And keep in mind the amino acids provided by the forage are not as available for digestion and absorption in the upper gut as the protein from the concentrate. And we want protein digested and absorbed as amino acids in the upper gut. We don't want the protein digested or fermented in the horse's hindgut. So I really count more on the protein from the concentrate for brood mares and growing horses than I do on the protein from the forages. That's not to say protein in the forages is not of consequence, because it is, but we want to make sure that they have adequate protein coming from an ingredient such as soybean meal, or in some situations even milk protein. Those are really high quality protein and amino acid sources for brood mares and babies. Much of the protein is supplied by the increase in the quantity of intake, because remember, the calorie requirements have really gone up at this point, and so feed intake has gone up at this point. And so when you increase the amount of feed, then you're increasing just the quantity of protein. For instance, if you're feeding 3 kilos or 6.6 pounds of a 14% protein feed, that's 420 grams of protein. If you've increased, then you get to lactation and you've increased the amount of feed from 3 kilos to 5 kilos or 11 pounds of the same 14% protein feed, you've upped the protein intake to 700 grams. So even though the percent protein in the feed has stayed the same, you've increased it so they're getting more grams of protein. Poor quality protein or unbalanced amino acid profile will reduce the efficiency of conversion to milk protein. Again, one of the reasons that I want to depend on adequate protein coming from the concentrate. with high quality protein source such as soybean meal, or again, sometimes milk protein. Some growth feeds do have milk protein added. Insufficient protein will cause a decrease in milk production and loss of muscle mass because that mare is going to be pulling the protein from her own stores in the muscle. Mineral needs of the lactating mares. So micronutrient disturbances may affect the balance between free radical formation and antioxidant production. And with that in mind, zinc, copper, and selenium, which actually all have some antioxidant roles in the body, have the potential to mitigate intrauterine growth retardation, which is a good thing. Selenium supplementation may also alleviate oxidative stress produced by production of reactive oxygen species from overnutrition. And in research, selenomethionine supplementation can influence selenium status of the foal by increasing concentrations of foal plasma and muscle and mare colostrum. So this is just a very bioavailable source of selenium, but the take home really is to make sure the mineral requirements, including zinc, copper, and selenium, are being met by the lactating mare's diet. Underfeeding will result in decreased milk production. And with decreased milk production, you're going to see poor weight gain in the foal and weight loss in the mare. And energy restriction during lactation can affect the ability of the mare to conceive. So this is not the time that we really want to try to get the mare to lose weight. Even though you might have a fat mare, unless it's a health concern of significant obesity, then again, during this time, we're not going to be trying to get the mare to lose weight. If the mare loses weight while lactating, it's very difficult to get the weight back on. So try to avoid letting the mare lose too much weight. And an overweight lactating mare may have decreased milk production. Excess weight is hard on the joints, hard on the hooves. Once again, beware body condition scoring. And a lot of times with these brood mares, I should have pointed this out when we talked about body condition scoring, because a lot of people they see this big belly on the brood mare and say, oh, my mare is fat. But when we talked about the places where you feel and evaluate to get a body condition score, didn't ever say the belly, because horses really don't carry fat in their belly. It's over the top line, again, over the crest of the neck, along the spine, the tail head, over the ribs, behind the shoulder, and it's not the belly. That's either because the mare is pregnant and she's got a fetus growing in there, or sometimes brood mares, over time, you got a brood mare that's had 6 babies in 6 years. Gravity will have its effect. She may have a hanging down belly, but don't get confused that that's fat. Evaluate the body condition score places to make sure that she is carrying fat where she needs to be. Feeding the lactating mare includes gradually increasing the amount fed before the mare foals. As I said, that last trimester, especially last month, you want to get her to the place where she's getting fed to support lactation, so we don't have a sudden change in diet when she's getting ready to foal. The quality and quantity of forage available and nutrient concentration of the concentrate will affect the requirements. Mares on good quality pasture may need only about 0.75 to 1.25% of their body weight in concentrate daily because they're getting a lot of nutrition from the good quality pasture. And heavy milkers, though, may need up to 1.75% of their body weight in concentrate to maintain. So you got to kind of look at what the total diet is and make sure that you are providing the concentrate and the forage to meet that lactating mare's needs. Forage-only diets will not meet nutrient requirements and will need supplementation. For a lactating mare, forage-only diet is just not going to do it in a healthy way at all. Just got to mention water requirements because remember, this mare is making milk and that's going to use a lot of water. In thermoneutral conditions, so this is when it's not terribly cold, it's not terribly hot, the horse is not using water for things like sweating, the requirement or intake of water still increases significantly, 1.8 to 2.5 times over maintenance with lactation. So we've got an increase in feed intake of 50 to 75%, increase for milk production, 37 to 74%. So a 500 kilo mare will need 40 to 78 liters of water per day. And the type of diet can also influence that intake because more fiber in the diet results in more water intake. Temperature and humidity can also affect that dramatically. If it gets hot and humid, the horse is going to need even more water. So take home, supply plenty of nice, clean, fresh water for this lactating mare. And now let's get to weaning. How are we going to manage the pregnant mare during weaning? First off, you got a lactating mare that is rebred will wean foal during mid-gestation of the next
Dr. Young?
pregnancy. Yes.
Dr. Young?
Sure.
I have a few, maybe before we move into this section, I have a few questions that people have asked, so we can just get these answered. First one was about gestation. Since their gestation is 11 months, give or take, where would we consider the third trimester to actually start?
That's usually considered about 9 to 11 months.
Okay. Next question. Some horse people advise to remove all concentrates from a mare for a few days before parturition. Is there any science or sense behind this advice?
No.
No, that's the first time I've heard that.
Yeah,
Just
I've
no.
not. No, I've never heard that.
I've never heard that either.
No, that seems like a pretty poor idea.
Yeah. If a mare adopts an orphan foal in addition to its own, shall we feed her for double milk production requirements? Is it safe to feed so much concentrate?
That is an excellent question, and that's a question I've not had before. So in thinking through that, once again, I'm going to say, be sure you are really monitoring that mare's body condition score and let the mare tell you. In general, if she's using those nutrients, I would give her those nutrients. I might think about what form I am providing those nutrients and make sure there is adequate forage. And then I might look at my choice of concentrate feeds and make sure, for instance, if I'm using a mare and foal feed, I'm probably going to want to go to a high fat and probably high fiber and moderate NSC feed to make sure that I'm not running a risk of overdoing the amount of NSC in a meal and disrupting the hindgut. The other thing I would absolutely do is feed that amount of feed in as many meals through the day as is feasible. So you've got smaller meals spaced through the day. And of course, always make sure that the mare is getting adequate forage, which, I mean, at least 1.2% of her body weight per day in forage and more than that. But then make sure that it's a high calorie concentrate so that you're getting adequate calories to her to support. That's a big load of lactation.
Yeah. Good.
But good questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Mhm.
Okay, back to weaning management. So again, I always think it's kind of interesting, I'm going to repeat this, that the lactating mare that is rebred will wean her foal during mid-gestation of the next pregnancy. So you're feeding for weaning and you're still feeding for mid-gestation. And while it's customary to withdraw the concentrates until milk production ceases, that's really not the best idea. You don't want to take the nutrition away from the mare. She's in mid-gestation. You're still supporting another fetus. And in any case, if there are unless you're feeding a really high quality forage, there's nutrients that mare will be missing if you take away all the concentrates. So it does not, withdrawing the concentrates does not hasten the cessation of milk production. That does not actually help the mare to dry up. And the feed withdrawal can have adverse effects on the developing fetus. The alteration of the maternal diet can impact the placental function and the transfer of nutrients to the fetus. It affects the prostaglandin production by the uterus, and the reduction in the nutrient transfer can result in slower cell division, which can reduce the cell number in organs. I mean, it's slowing down the growth of the fetus. This is not something you want to do during mid-gestation. Again, it's not the best idea for the mare, even if she's not rebred, because she still has her own nutrient needs. So the recommendation is not to take the feed away from her in an effort to dry her out. That's, again, it's not necessary. And the other thing, the concentrate can be helpful with a thin mare who needs to gain weight that's lost during lactation. So the actual recommendation is to taper down the intakes during the last month of lactation to a reasonable amount before the weaning. So she's already down to maybe her maintenance level or her mid-gestation amount of feed by the time you get to weaning. And mares with higher body condition scores handle feed withdrawal more effectively than thin mares. So another point to support being familiar with body condition scoring and keeping a very close monitor of that with your mares. Okay, so we're moving from mares to babies. I'm guessing we're caught up on questions. Okay. Babies are amazing little growth machines. Now, the fetus was pretty much a growth machine too, because while the size of birth, that baby is only 10% of its adult weight, within a year, it's going to reach 90% of its adult height. And I don't have it in this presentation, but I also, if you look at those babies and the height of the baby and the length of those babies' legs, they are actually for a baby that just came out of its mama, it's a pretty high percentage of its adult height. If it was the same thing with humans, boy, as a female human, I would never ever want to give birth. That would be pretty horrific. But back to the size, the adult size, the maximum adult size of a horse is genetically predetermined, but the growth rate and the maximum height that baby actually attains is influenced by the environment, the nutrition, and the management. Even though the maximum height that baby could be is determined by genetics, the maximum height that they actually will be, you can sure affect. We do absolutely know if babies are deficient in some nutrients, their growth will be stunted. They will never reach their genetic potential for size. And if you think about that logically, we know that. Think about wild horses. You very rarely see a 17-hand wild horse, and they don't have the diets to support the maximum genetic height. Now, if you don't want to have a 17-hand horse, you can stunt their growth, but it's probably not going to be very healthy growth. Horse does not obtain the maximum bone mineral content, or BMC, until 6 years. So think about that. Until 6 years, horses are still putting mineral, they're still growing their bones. The bone mineral content is still increasing. At birth, the foal has 70% of the adult bone mineral content. At 6 months, they have 68.5% of the adult BMC. So in the first 6 months, they go from 17% to 68.5%. Again, these babies are just growing machines. And at 1 year, the foal has 76% of their adult BMC. The length and the width of the growth of long bones is the growth priority in the young horse. Take home for that, we got to feed them to support these little growing machines. Energy requirements for growing horses. The energy or calorie requirement just is equal to the energy they need for maintenance plus the energy that's required to support the growth of these little growing machines. The energy and nutrient requirements are determined by the body weight, the rate of gain, body composition, and the utilization rate for building body tissues. And so it's going to be different from horse to horse and to some extent breed to breed. If you think about it, like the rate of gain, depending on what the horse's adult maximum is genetically determined. For instance, let's look at the rate of gain for a quarter horse that's going to max out at 15 hands versus the rate of gain for a Clydesdale that's going to max out at 18 hands. That's going to be a different rate of gain. While yes, a quarter horse might mature a little quicker than a Clydesdale, it's not, percentage-wise, it's not that big of a difference. There's going to be a big difference in the rate of gain. We need to provide the energy and the nutrients for moderate and consistent growth. So we have nice, healthy gains throughout the growth phase of that young growing horse. We need to monitor growth rates monthly. We want to match the energy supply to the current need of the foal. Growing too fast, if you find that the baby is, the rate of gain is just too fast, we want to decrease the energy in the diet. If they're growing too slow, we might want to increase the energy, because we do know that the calories can, to a large extent, dictate the rate of gain. More calories, they grow faster. Fewer calories, they grow slower. However, we also need to look at the other nutrients, because the other nutrients, if we're increasing calories to increase rate of gain, we must increase the other nutrients to support that rate of gain. There has been research on supporting fast rates of gains in horses, because it's always kind of, throughout my lifetime in horses, there's always been a fear of a rapid rate of gain, because the thought is that leads to more DODs, bone disorders. But it has been seen in research that, again, a lot of these horses genetically, they do have high rates of gains, and if you support them nutritionally with the calories to support the higher rate of gains, but with the protein, vitamins, and minerals so that the rate of gain is healthy growth, then you can be all right. But we still, in general, we want a moderate growth rate, and we want consistent growth. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that energy requirements do fluctuate with local temperatures. Below lower critical temperatures, the digestible energy needs increase about 1.3% per degree Celsius. So as the horse is needing energy to keep itself warm, it needs more calories to support, those needs. And lower critical temperature is dependent on adapted climate. So whatever that horse is adapted to, that's where you need to think about the lower critical temperature, just like humans. Humans are adapted to the climate where they live for the most part, and they go to a different climate, and their critical temperature, or just to really simplify, temperatures where they're comfortable are vastly different. I mean, just think about, I am sure, Lori, between you in Canada and me in Kansas, you're going to be much more comfortable at a colder temperature than I am. I'm going to be bundling up, and you might be out there in short sleeves saying, this is really nice. So it's the adapted climate. And finally, the thing to do is feed to maintain a smooth growth curve. Whether you're dealing with a rapid rate of growth, a moderate rate of growth, or a slower rate of growth, you want the growth curve very smooth. And this chart just kind of shows slow growth rate and fast growth rate. If we have, there's a range of optimal growth rate, and to a large extent, that is kind of genetically determined by the animal. But if we start stepping in and trying to force growth rates, for instance, we start really trying to slow down the growth rate and we get to the point of a retarded growth rate, then we start seeing problems with that. On the other hand, and in some industries, we want to support a really fast growth rate. We're trying to grow these babies as fast as possible. And if we don't do it carefully, we can increase the likelihood of DODs, or again, bone abnormalities. So there are consequences when we are not providing nutrition to support optimal growth. High dietary energy will increase rate of growth to the genetic max. Excess, on the other hand, if they're getting excess calories, it can be stored as fat tissue. Sometimes higher calories can lead to heightened excitability, and higher calories, especially if not supported by other nutrient components, can lead to skeletal abnormalities. Factors, on the other hand, that slow growth would include a change in ambient temperature. Weaning, the stress of weaning can slow growth. Excuse me. Psychological stress can slow growth, and decreasing dietary energy, decreasing calories, will slow growth. Another interesting requirement to keep in mind with growing horses is compensatory growth. The body rebounds from slow growth by rapid growth, and that's called compensatory growth. You can see that going from winter to spring. The growth rate just when we get into spring may speed up. And there are a lot of factors that can be contributing to that. And a lot of times it comes back to the nutritional component. It may have to do with temperature and activity and that type of thing, but there's a big nutritional component in compensatory growth. And the times we really see compensatory growth is, for instance, people who buy young horses. You buy a weanling. I personally had this happen with a 4-year-old. And a 4-year-old, you would think, okay, growth is pretty well slowed down. Not thinking this horse is going to grow too much anymore. And I had this happen, and between the ages of 4.5 to about 5.5, this horse grew 2 inches. I was going, you're not supposed to grow 2 inches. What the heck is going on here? It's compensatory growth. Because if the horse is on a poor nutritional program, that is restricting its growth, and then you put it on a good nutritional program, if they are still in the growing phase, you will get a period of compensatory growth when the body is kind of catching up to what its genetic max might be. So be prepared for that. Short-term dietary energy restrictions can result in compensatory growth when the energy comes back into the diet. Long-term dietary energy restriction will affect ability for compensatory growth. But again, you can see compensatory growth anytime that the nutritional program has been deficient and then it is replenished. And then the baby's body says, I've got the nutrients, I can grow again. That may not be healthy. Again, we want a smooth growth curve. And so when you start putting peaks and valleys in your growth curve, that can be higher risk for DODs. More requirements for growing horses. The protein requirement is higher in a growing horse because protein or amino acids is needed to build body tissues. Across breeds, 13 to 17% protein is adequate for maximum growth, and that is 13 to 17% protein in the total diet, not just the concentrate. Excess protein, and people get scared of protein, and I would rather, especially for a growing horse, I want to meet their amino acid requirements. A little bit of excess protein, if there's more amino acids than the body needs, they can be broken down and used as calories. And excess could be stored as a little bit of fat tissue. Now, if you see a baby that's getting overly fat, I will talk about that. You don't want to see that, but a little bit of fat tissue is okay. And you're going to see some increased nitrogen in the feces and the urine. But again, a little bit of excess is just not a big concern. Huge excess might be, I wouldn't want to see a young growing horse that's like getting 25% protein in the total diet. That might be a little concerning. But like a baby, especially an easy keeper that is on good quality forage, and such an easy keeper, you don't want to feed a Marin full feed because it doesn't need the calories and you're feeding a ration balancer. Yeah, that 28 to 32% protein in the ration balancer, that little small amount of ration balancer, does not worry me at all. Keep in mind, horses have amino acid requirements, not a crude protein requirement. So the amino acid content isn't as important as the total protein content of the diet. The key amino acids for growth are lysine and threonine. And we do know in research, if a young growing horse is deficient in the amino acid lysine, its growth will be stunted. It will not grow to its genetic potential. And in research from 1994, weanlings grew more rapidly with 9% crude protein and added amino acids lysine and threonine than a 14% crude protein feed that may not have been adequate in the limiting amino acids lysine and threonine. So again, it's not just the crude protein, it is the quality of the protein or the amount of essential amino acids. Bone and cartilage formation is supported by the amino acids glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline. We don't know what the actual nutritional requirements for young growing horses of all the amino acids are. We know what essential amino acids there are, but we don't have the research in horses. The swine people are way ahead of us than equine nutrition in knowing all the amino acid requirements for the growth of baby pigs. There's just lots we do not know for growing horses, but we do know the amino acids, and we do pretty well know the first 3 limiting amino acids. So again, we want to make sure that the protein is a high quality protein that does supply adequate amounts of essential amino acids. And then, of course, other nutrients need to be in adequate amounts to support the increased rate of growth stimulated by the amino acid supply. Protein content then of the feedstuffs. As I keep saying, higher quality proteins, milk proteins, soybean, Alfalfa. Milk protein is an amazingly high quality protein source. It's also a very expensive protein source. Of course, mare's milk is a wonderful amino acid source. But once you get into feeds, soybean meal is the highest quality amino acid source of the plant proteins. And alfalfa meal is a pretty decent quality protein, pretty decent amino acid profile, but not nearly as good as soybean meal. For young growing horses, if alfalfa is the only source of protein, it is not adequate in lysine to support optimal growth. Lower quality that you're going to tend to see in the feeds would be the protein in distillers grains, cottonseed meal, cereal grains. For growing horses, we really don't want to depend on those plant protein sources. We want to be looking more, again, soybean meal is an excellent plant protein source, and then milk protein. To improve bioavailability of dietary protein, provide smaller, more frequent meals, which kind of goes back to, the lactating mare, especially the question when we've got a mare that's nursing two foals. But even for growing horses, smaller, more frequent meals, that will give the most efficient digestion and absorption of all nutrients, not just proteins and amino acids, but the other thing is that more closely mimics natural feeding behavior. So either for an adult horse that's kind of grazing all the time, or for a nursing baby, they're not just nursing twice a day. They're nursing whenever they have the urge to nurse, and mama's in the right mood for it. Vitamin and mineral requirements change with the growth rate. Vitamins, vitamin A for growth and other needs. And I've mentioned this before, we want to be sure we supplement when the horse is not consuming green forage. Vitamin D, which is essential for bone metabolism, if the horse, especially a growing horse, is not in plenty of sunshine, then we probably need vitamin D supplementation to support that bone, growth and function. And then vitamin E, which is absolutely needed for immune function as well as many other things. Supplementation is needed when not consuming green forages or with inadequate selenium intakes. Minerals for the growing horses. Over 90% of the calcium and phosphorus and 80% of the magnesium is deposited in the fetus during the last trimester. So you think about that, that is a large amount of minerals that baby is getting from mama before it's even born. That does not mean that the babies still don't need minerals. Now, during lactation, the suckling is getting those minerals primarily from the milk. But once the baby has been weaned, we do need to make sure that it is still getting adequate minerals to support bone growth and other functions, other body growth, all through this maximal growth period. There are ratios that are also I've got a duplicate here. There are ratios that are suggested and are important in growing horses. The calcium to phosphorus ratio is very important. We know that we need a maximum, well, in general, we want about a 1-to-1, 2-to-1 ratio of calcium and phosphorus. The suggested max for growing horses is about 3-to-1. But in research, they've fed up to about 6-to-1 calcium to phosphorus and not seen problems as long as there is adequate dietary phosphorus. If there is too much calcium in the diet, that can actually inhibit phosphorus absorption, but it takes quite a bit of calcium. If there is more phosphorus in the diet, that absolutely interferes with calcium absorption, and then that horse, any horse, is going to be calcium deficient. For growing horses, you will not be getting adequate growth. You will not be getting good bone growth and bone health. And so we want to make sure that the calcium phosphorus ratio is appropriate. Zinc and copper, the suggested ratio is about 5:1 for a max and 3:1 for a minimum. That's not been defined as well in research. And in general, we're usually going to see adequate natural zinc and copper ratios. Now, in forages, the ratios are often not all that bad, but forages tend to be marginal to deficient in copper, and most forages are deficient in zinc. So you want to make sure that there is a nutritional source of adequate copper and zinc being fed to the young growing horse to make sure you're supporting good, healthy growth. And there's research showing that adequate supply of copper in late gestation may decrease incidence of skeletal abnormalities in foal. Remember, I talked about the liver stores feeding mama will actually affect the liver stores of that fetus. So when the baby is born, it has adequate liver stores. So again, got to feed mama to support the baby. Zinc and manganese also have roles in skeletal and cartilage development, so those need to be adequate in the diet. Selenium is needed for immune function. Iodine is important for metabolism, and either deficiency or toxicity can result in goiter, particularly in young growing horses. Silicon may actually improve skeletal development. This was seen by Brian Nielsen and others back in 1993, actually in his graduate work. Excess mineral intake is possible when rations are over-fortified, because that happens often when there's an inappropriate mixture of forages, feeds, and supplements. Especially with supplementing, it's really easy to get things over-fortified or unbalanced when you start throwing in a lot of nutritional supplements. Mineral excesses also can occur through environmental contamination. So how do you determine the balance in the diet of all these nutrients? Well, the best method of determining nutrient deficiencies, excesses, or imbalances is through a ration evaluation. And that is a nice thing. Kentucky Equine Research has an amazing ration balancing or ration evaluation program called MicroSteed. And these are just some charts from MicroSteed showing really how simple it is to do a ration evaluation. And while there are lots of outfits that would like to run blood tests or hair mineral analyses or all sorts of interesting ways to try to figure out if your horse's diet is actually balanced, really the only way to do that is a ration evaluation. And most of these other methods are not at all accurate in taking like the minerals in a horse's hair and comparing that to that doesn't really tell you much of anything about the mineral status, particularly about the diet. It may tell you a little bit about if a few minerals like selenium, possibly if there has been toxicity problems. You might be able to find that from a hair mineral analysis, and you might find some drugs actually can be determined from hair mineral analysis, but not at all a good method to use for evaluating the horse's nutritional status. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the different phases of the foal. Feeding the suckling foal. So when the foal is still on mama, remember the nutrient concentration of the milk kind of goes up from early lactation and then goes kind of exponentially down. So the basic strategy in feeding the suckling foal, I should have started out with milk. That's the basic strategy. But along with milk, particularly when the milk quality and quantity is dropping off, we want to have good quality forage, pasture grass, alfalfa, high quality grass hay, and then a concentrate feed for growing foals with adequate vitamin mineral fortification, high protein, 16 to 18%. And for the suckling foal, the recommended feeding rate is about 1 pound per month of age per day. And this is of a feed that is designed, and most mare and foal feeds are formulated so they can be used as a creep feed And it's ideal to feed the baby separately from the dam, because if you don't know how much of the creep feed that the baby is eating. And sometimes that mare may eat it all. She may let baby have a few nibbles, but when her milk quality is going down, you want to make sure that the nutrient content from the creep feed is supplying the nutrients that are lacking then in the milk. You want to carefully monitor the growth. As I said before, we want a nice smooth growth curve. And the way to to me, the easiest way to monitor the growth curve is to monitor the baby's body condition score. You don't want the baby getting fat. You don't want the baby too thin. There are going to be times you're going to see a little bit of ribs. And for baby, that's not a big problem. I'm okay with a little bit of ribs, but you don't want to see a lot of ribs and you don't want to see a lot of fat cover. In general, we still want to keep them about a body condition score 5. If they're growing too rapidly or they're laying on some fat, we want to reduce the calories. And in some situations, if the mama is a really great milker and you've got a baby that's fat and or growing too rapidly and then laying on fat, we may even have to wean a little bit early if that's necessary. The other thing, and this is not really feeding the suckling foal, but for health of the suckling foal, you want to make sure there's sufficient exercise for bone development and strength. So that's avoid keeping in confinement or a stall for more than 10 hours a day. And actually there is research that shows that the typical activity of babies with kind of running around a little bit and getting the zoomies and being silly, that is actually the best activities to support healthy bone growth. And sometimes it's hard when the mares are foaling very early in the year and the weather, you're in a colder climate and the weather's really bad and you don't want that mare and baby outside in ice and nastiness. And you're going, I need to keep them in. So sometimes it's really hard to get them out. But in those situations, keep in mind, if you can, that activity is healthier for the baby to support good bone development. Now, why creep feed? Again, I am a big fan of creep feeding because, again, that mare's milk begins to lose nutritional value and volume after about 8 weeks of lactation and then continues to do so as lactation continues. So allowing the foal access to a creep feed will, number one, provide the nutrition that may be lacking in the milk, and number two, it lets the baby adjust to appropriate feed before weaning, which will reduce one potential stress of weaning. And weaning is already really stressful for the baby. So if it's already used to some feed and that's going to continue, that is one change that does not have to happen during weaning. So in my opinion, there's very few reasons not to offer some creep feed. And again, it's ideal to be separate from the mare, whether that's in a creep feeder, however you can do it. But if the only way is to let the baby nibble some of mama's feed, then just make sure that you're adding that amount for the baby on top of the mare's feed so that the mare is not going to suffer nutritionally. Now you've gotten to weaning. So how do you feed the weanling foal? Really not a whole lot different, except we don't have milk to depend on now. But the basic strategy is good quality forage, same pasture grass, alfalfa, high quality grass hay. Hopefully at this point, the baby has been eaten along some with mama. And so you go to weaning, and now we're just making sure that we have an adequate amount to support the weanling's needs. And the concentrate feed for growing foals, probably going to be the same feed you were feeding to your mare. A good quality mare and foal feed, adequate vitamin mineral fortification, high protein, 14 to 16% in the feed, feeding rate. For the weanling, you've started at that 1 pound per month of age per day, but then at weaning, then you're going to look at the feed tag and say, this is the amount that I'm going to feed for my weanling foal. And again, you're going to carefully monitor the growth, reduce calories if growing too rapidly, switch to a ration balancer, At this point, for a weanling, you can switch to a ration balancer if it's a baby that's growing fast and an easy keeper, and you're maintaining a good body condition score of about 5, and you're going, okay, looking at the feeding recommendations for this weanling, if I feed that much, it's going to get too fat. And that's the time the good quality forage and a ration balancer can do a really nice job for a weanling foal. It's not something that we're going to use for a suckling, but good for a weanling in many cases. And again, the goal is a smooth growth curve. So general requirements for growing horses. The growth potential is a combination of genetic potential plus the available dietary energy. Even with maximum energy input, a foal is not going to grow beyond its genetic potential. If the genetics say this is going to be a 15 two-hand horse at its max, no amount of nutrition is going to make it a 16-hand horse. And some other factors that affect the growth rates are going to be the breed, the management, the owner's objectives. Owners can affect the growth rate and, get them to grow the maximum growth rate. But in those situations, we also want to be aware that deviations in growth can cause developmental orthopedic disease, and which DOD, and DOD is a multifactorial disease. Nutrition, genetics, exercise, conformation, hormones, and trauma all can affect the incidence of DOD. One of the things, again, I keep mentioning, one of the things we know can affect the incidence of DOD is irregular growth rates. Fluctuating growth rates with periods of slower decreased growth followed by growth spurts may affect DOD, hence we want that smooth growth curve. Non-uniform growth rates can occur due to dietary and environmental stress in puberty, and a pattern of slow early growth is more appropriate for foals that will not be sold as yearlings, because if you're not trying to get a baby ready for market or ready for sale or ready for shows, then you can go and feed and manage for a nice moderate growth rate that's going to be less risky for development of DODs. Delaying rapid growth until after the window of vulnerability for bone and joint disease, which is less than about 12 months of age, significantly reduces the risk of growth-related DODs. So if you can, for that first year, stick with that nice moderate growth rate, then that will help in reducing the risk of DODs. So let's talk briefly about bone disorders in growing horses. Nutrition may play an important role in the pathogenesis of DODs. Nutrient deficiencies, nutrient excesses, and nutrient imbalances all can increase the risk of DODs. And there are various DODs. One of the most common is physitis. Physitis is the inflammation of the growth plate, also known as epiphysitis or physeal dysplasia. And that occurs when endochondral ossification or bone development is interrupted in the metaphyseal growth cartilage. Physitis generally develops between the ages of 3 to 8 months at 3 primary points: the distal radius, which is above the knee, the distal cannon, which is above the fetlock, and the distal tibia, which is above the hock. But a lot of times we see where it's circled there, the distal cannon right above the fetlock. The primary indication of physitis is joint inflammation caused by enlargement of the growth plate. The baby may or may not be lame. The swelling can be firm to the touch and slightly warm, and it tends to be associated with high energy intakes to promote rapid growth, especially when the other nutrient profile is not adequate to support that rapid growth rate. Traumatic injury can also increase risk of physitis, and genetic predisposition definitely increases the risk of physitis. You see it often in foals with excess calorie intake, such as foals and weanlings grazing lush pasture and consuming large concentrate meals. Foals of mares with prolific milk production have increased risk of developing fasciitis. But one of the things that happens when this occurs, it's associated with rapid growth rate. A lot of times the first reaction is, okay, let's reduce the growth rate. So let's take all the feed away from the foal and maintain them just like on grass hay. Well, the problem there is we just took away a lot of the nutrition that supports healthy growth. So in these situations, my recommendation is more, okay, let's look at the amount of concentrate and still keep them on good quality forage, but maybe we take out the concentrate and put back in a ration balancer because it's the amount of calories. So let's lower the calories of the total diet, but let's keep the nutrition of the total diet still supportive for good, healthy growth. Back off the calories, but keep the good nutrition. If the baby's getting fasciitis and it's due to the mare with the prolific milk production, in some situations, those are times to look at, is the baby old enough that we can go ahead and wean it so we can get it off of the excess amount of milk. But the key to is ensure the foal is receiving the energy required for steady growth as well as all the nutrients needed for sound growth. So again, to reduce energy intake, maybe wean the foal. If you've got them on alfalfa, which is very energy-rich hay, maybe put them on a really good quality grass-based hay, which is going to be a little lower calorie. And again, maybe replace that high energy concentrates for a ration balancer. If foal is lame, then we want to reduce activity until pain subsides. Osteochondrosis is another of the DODs, and that is a disruption in the differentiation, proliferation, and endochondral maturation, and eventual ossification in rapidly growing animals. So again, a bone abnormality. The terminology, there are 3 different terms that are kind of all lumped together with osteochondrosis, but they're different terms. Osteochondrosis is the disease. Osteochondritis is the inflammatory response of the disease. And osteochondritis dissecans, which is actually the OCD, is the condition where chips or cysts develop. And that's the OCD that's the condition that we're dealing with a baby with a bone abnormality that we may be able to influence, or in some situations we may not be. So osteochondrosis occurs in articular cartilage versus cartilage in the growth plate. And there is lameness associated with the articular cartilage. Clinical signs can appear at any age, but there appears to be windows of opportunity when the risk is heightened or the osteochondrosis is more common. It may resolve without intervention. And that's one of the tricky things when you start, veterinarians or the owners start having veterinarians radiograph to see looking for osteochondrosis. And when you're doing this with young growing horses, you don't know if this is a situation that actually may resolve itself in time. Now you get to an age of a growing horse that it's like, okay, this is probably not going to resolve without some intervention. And intervention, early on, you may be able to have some effect with nutrition, but you get to a point where the surgery is going to be the intervention, and surgery has a really good prognosis at removing chips, but it's a difficult prognosis when it's looking at trying to deal with cysts. And there are 3 phases of osteochondrosis. The first phase is just, if you can see my mouse here pointing at this little knobby spot. It's a focal lesion that develops in articular cartilage or just under the articular cartilage that is otherwise healthy. It's a disruption of cellular differentiation during growth of the cartilage. and there's a failure of maturation and ossification of the chondrocytes while they're in the zone of differentiation under the layer of the maturation of chondrocytes. So this is just a little abnormality. That's the first phase. The second phase then is necrosis of the basal layer of hypertrophic cartilage with subsequent pressure and tension inside the joint, forming a spot for fissures in damaged cartilage. So you can see at this point, the little thing I pointed out before, this point you're starting to get necrosis in the basal layer. So it's really starting to become an issue. But then in the third phase, you get fragmentation or total release of the damaged cartilage fragments. So this is when you actually have osteochondritis dissecans or OCD, and that's when you've got a fragment. And that's when, for surgery, taking out that chip can be quite successful. Suggested factors, there's a lot of factors for in the development of osteochondrosis. It's multifactorial, rapid growth with nutritional imbalances in particular, hormone, endocrine factors, biomechanical stress, trauma, lack of exercise, inadequate vascularization or blood supply, and then of course genetic predisposition. There was a study in warm blood foals that found a higher incidence of osteochondrosis in foals with a high plane of nutrition and low exercise, equally as with a low plane of nutrition and intensive exercise. So it is a very tricky situation, and there actually was a look at, how much osteochondrosis would you see just naturally having nothing to do with human intervention in growth. And they found that actually even in wild horse herds, I believe it was about a 10% incidence of osteochondrosis. So it's to some extent a natural phenomenon that we cannot, with management and nutrition, we've not been able to completely erase or eradicate in horses. So recommendation for feeding foals, once the lesions have formed, it's too late to go back and have an impact on the lesions with changes in the diet. Once they've formed, they are there. But regardless, it's recommended to reduce energy consumption until recovered from surgery. So good quality hay, the ration balancer to supply protein, vitamins, and minerals to support the nutrition, but reduce calories to slow down the growth rate. Feeding practices that do contribute to DOD, too much energy. In one study, a high energy diet or 129% of NRC requirement caused a 92% incident of multiple OCD lesions, and also resulted in an 8% incidence of, high protein diet or 129% of NRC requirement resulted in an 8% incidence of OCD lesions, which was the same as the control diet. So again, calories, the high calories were the concern, not more protein than requirement. Another study, weight matters. In a Kentucky study of 271 thoroughbred foals found a 10% incidence of OCD, and hock and stifle OCDs tended to occur in heavier foals because of biomechanical forces. Mineral deficient diets also can contribute to DODs. Calcium and phosphorus deficient diets correlate with higher incidence of osteochondrosis. Copper deficiencies of pregnant mares resulted in higher incidence of physitis and OCD in the young growing horses. And foals with chronically higher insulin from high starch diets, the thought there is that can trigger imbalances in chondrocyte maturation and delays ossification. And then insulin can stimulate removal of thyroid hormone or T4 from circulation. And these are foals, again, chronically higher insulin from very high starch diets. So it's not something I always want to throw out there, because people start worrying that you can't even feed a sweet feed to a young growing horse. And that's really a misconception. When you start looking at the research with high starch diets, these are very high starch diets, not a typical moderate starch diet that you see, even a feed that's kind of, oats and maybe a little bit of corn based. So there are a lot of young growing horses that do great on typical sweet feeds, but you certainly wouldn't want to try and grow a foal on like straight corn or even corn with a ration balancer, because those are going to be foals that you see chronically higher insulin responses. So feeding recommendations to prevent or actually reduce the risk of DODs: a balanced diet. For the mare, adequate protein, minerals, and vitamins without excessive energy, particularly in the third trimester, and again, monitor the body condition score. If creep feeding, use appropriate type feeds for young horses with adequate lysine. A moderately low starch diet for mare and foal. Don't go wild with NSC, but in general for horses, we don't need to go wild with NSC. Moderate moderate to low is a good place to be. Increase use of fat and digestible fiber to supply calories, and some starch is important for growth. We do get people that start trying to take all the starch out of a horse's diet, and you don't want to do that because horses do need some starch. And of course, monitor growth and make adjustments if the foal is growing too rapidly, and be careful to avoid compensatory growth. We want that smooth growth curve. Overall, avoid overfeeding, but meet requirements. There aren't really simple rules about how much feed is too much, so monitor weight and body condition score for healthy growth, monitor growth curve and body condition score. Forage availability and quality will dictate appropriate feed choices. A ration evaluation can be helpful, and to reduce calories, maybe grass hay instead of alfalfa, and a balancer pellet rather than a concentrate feed. And that is all I've got. Thank you so much. If you've hung in there all the way through, thank you very much for your time and attention. And I would be happy if you've got any questions.
Yeah, there are a few questions. I was making notes, and literally a minute before you would say something, then you would almost cover what I was about to ask because of all the questions that I get from customers. So you did mention protein a couple times, which I wanted to cover, that high protein diet is not the cause of OCDs. So
Nope.
I think you covered that a couple of times. One of the things I did want to mention, I'll get to the questions that have been asked, but one of the things that I see in the field is that sometimes new breeders or new people with young foals are confused with the size of the foal, and they're feeding for the size and not for growth. So they think because the foal is so small, you feed a really small amount of feed. Do you want to say anything to that? Because I know I have a saying that from Claire Thunes about that foals have huge requirements. I mean,
Yes.
the requirements of a mature horse is what a foal's requirements are in basic terms.
Yeah. In general, and you've got to remember, yes, the foal itself is smaller than an adult horse, but you're feeding it to grow into the adult horse. So
Mm-hmm.
their nutrient requirements are quite large. So again, your best friend is body condition scoring. So you feed that baby to maintain it at a body condition score of approximately 5 with an appropriate feed that's got the nutrients in it to balance out the calories in the feed. So the calories are supporting the body condition score, but the growth feed is what's going to have the protein, vitamins, and minerals. And man, if you look at the feeding charts, like one of the things that even the feeding chart for a ration balancer, a typical ration balancer for an adult horse, that's going to be 1 to 2 pounds a day. But for like a hard growing yearling, you may be the feeding chart may actually tell you feed 3 pounds of the ration balancer,
Yes.
which you're going, that's a lot of nutrition. But yeah, that baby is needing a lot of nutrition because they are just little growing machines.
Yeah, and I don't think people realize, you're laying down bone. You're growing bone, you're growing tissue. So,
Absolutely. And one of the things that kind of relates to this, um, but there actually was a study years ago. I can't even quote it because it's an old study, but they compared feeding, at that time alfalfa and oats was a typical growth diet, and they compared feeding alfalfa and oats to, I think it was a grass hay and a balanced, growth feed.
mhm,
And what they saw is that the the babies on the alfalfa and oats got fat, and the
mhm,
babies on the balanced feed got tall
yeah,
because they were
because they were
getting the
getting
nutrition to support their growth. And
exactly.
if you're feeding more calories without the nutrition to support growth, they'll grow as far as they can on the nutrition they're getting, but then the extra calories, they can't use them to grow because they don't have the other nutrients, so they lay it on as fat.
That's right.
So again, body condition score and feed to support your baby's growth rate.
Yeah. The next one I jotted down was the 16% sweet feeds. And, sometimes I'm explaining to people, yes, you might be getting some protein there, but they're not formulated for growing horses. So if you don't have a ration
Right.
balancer and some help with that, but these typical sweet feeds that are really high in NSC, but they're not formulated. They don't have the premix. It's not formulated for growing horses.
Right. Yeah, you've got, and I know on the feed tags in the US, there there should be a purpose statement that states what class of horses that feed is designed for.
Right.
So if it doesn't say on the feed that it is formulated to support growing brood mares and or growing horses, then yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Now, if you talk to somebody at the feed company that can help you, there sometimes might be a performance feed that, and I mean, there are a lot of performance feeds that are going to be perfectly appropriate for 2 and 3-year-olds that are still
Mm-hmm.
growing. But a performance feed for the first year, no,
Yeah.
no, it needs to be a feed formulated for that.
Yes. And properly balanced.
Yep.
And then the last one that I wrote down was the NSC and addressing that, yes, they do need a moderate amount of NSC. We don't
Yes.
want these growing horses on very low NSC diets.
Right.
They need that energy to grow. So
Right. And it's interesting too, because what is considered a low NSC, because even 5 years ago, 20% or below NSC
yeah,
was considered low.
yeah,
And you never saw feeds that were like below 12% NSC, and now you do. I would not feed that to a young growing horse.
no,
20% NSC, I would not have any problems with. And moderate NSC to me is,
25.
20 to me, it's, 20 to 30 easily. And
Mm,
even 30 to 40 is not really particularly high NSC. Mama's milk is actually about in early lactation, I believe that's about 65% sugar. So
mm-hmm.
babies are getting NSC.
Yeah,
Now, straight corn is not something I would recommend.
yeah,
Even corn with a balancer pellet, as I said, no,
yeah,
that's a lot of NSC. And even oats are about 50% NSC. So straight grains, at least oats are not terribly scary, but you get into barley and corn and they're
yeah,
getting higher and higher. But
yeah.
Yeah, I'm okay with moderate NSC amounts for young growing horses, unless
Mhm.
if it's a baby that's coming from parents that are known to be insulin resistant already, and you might have a genetic predisposition to metabolic issues, okay, maybe
That's
you're going to
different.
start in the more 20 to 25.
Yeah. Good.
But those I think are more the exceptions.
Okay, I've got a few questions. I think you sort of touched on some of these, but there's three questions, so I'll go through them again. How do we manage post-winter compensatory growth? Does it make sense to feed a little more than requirements beyond thermoregulation in the fall and winter, and maybe a little less in the beginning of pasture season?
Okay, would you repeat that?
How do we manage post-winter compensatory growth? Does it make sense to feed a little more than requirements beyond thermal regulation in the fall and winter, and maybe a little less in the beginning of pasture season?
Yeah, I can see where they're going with that.
Yeah,
When the baby's going from winter and of course at this point if the baby is going from winter into spring, I'm thinking we're talking either about sucklings or yearlings at this point. So mama's going to take care of a lot of that
yeah.
because the sucklings can be on mama's milk. Now, if you're talking about a yearling and you're going from feed and hay into green grass, and what do you feed with that? Yes, in that situation, you do want to look at what you're feeding. You may want to be backing off on the amount of feed. You're
Yeah,
still going to introduce them probably to the grass gradually to
gradually.
yeah, let the microbes get adjusted to the whole new forage source. But once again, watch the body condition score and let that dictate
Yes.
the amount of concentrate. Because if the baby starts gaining too much fat,
Yeah,
then you're going to back off the amount of mare and foal feed, or potentially even back off all the way to a ration balancer.
yeah.
So yeah, that's how you would kind of avoid the situation of compensatory growth and try to manage to maintain that smooth growth rate and the smooth curve.
I send out body condition scoring charts lots, a lot.
Yep,
I attach them to almost every email.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's one of the most important tools every horse owner needs to be aware of.
And I'm always sometimes worried because almost every email I'm answering, I am trying to get people to, fingertips across the ridge. Come back to me. Go to the barn. Tell me what you feel.
Yep,
A
yep,
picture, I can't see it. I want to know what you feel.
yep,
And then we can decide where we're at. But
absolutely.
for the next one, uh, she may be confused, but anyways, is basically iron and copper ratio important?
I did see that question, and there is no research indicating that there is an iron copper ratio. There's a
Copper to
lot of,
zinc.
yeah, there's that really, we do know that zinc and copper can have um, an antagonistic relationship. We do know that, and we see it more in other species. And I actually did my first graduate research project was on copper and zinc because the thought at that time was excess zinc may inhibit copper absorption and create copper deficiencies and increase risk of DODs in young horses. And so while the requirement for zinc is 40 parts per million in the total diet and 10 parts per million in the total diet, and so that's like a 4-to-1 ratio. That doesn't mean they have to be in that ratio in the total diet. That's just what the requirement is.
Right.
And so for my research, I fed up to about 800 parts per million zinc and 10 parts per million copper. Did not see any inhibition of copper absorption. So in my conclusion on that study was you might have a problem if the horse is grazing near a zinc smelter.
Yeah.
So So we don't have where that ratio should be, but it's more of an issue in other species. Now, the iron, there's no indication that iron, we have no idea if where a ratio might need to be, other than horses get a tremendous amount of iron in their diets because their feed is all grown on dirt.
Yeah.
And they're grazing and they're ingesting dirt. And when you have your forages analyzed, you have your feed analyzed, especially feed with beet pulp in it, because beet pulp comes with quite a load of iron.
Yeah.
But that iron, those plant sources of iron, are very poorly digested and absorbed. They mostly go right on through and go back out into the dirt.
Yeah.
So we really, there's no research indicating that high iron, high dietary iron is affecting other absorption rates of minerals. We don't have research that it's there's a thought out there that it may be causing metabolic issues and insulin resistance in horses. That has not been shown to be true. There are some studies in rhinos that obese metabolic rhinos do show higher stored concentrations of iron in their tissues. So is there a relationship between metabolic syndrome and iron storage? We don't know. Maybe.
We don't know yet.
Yeah. I'd go back to if you've got a metabolic horse, try not to let it become obese and sedentary.
Yeah.
You know, ride it, exercise it, try to keep it more insulin sensitive, try to keep that from not being a problem. But we don't have any indication that, any ratios of iron to any other minerals are of concern in horses.
Good. The next one, what is the most practical method to monitor growth curve? A lot of barns don't have scales. I think she was a little confused on that, but I think you did sort of address it a few times, and it's the body condition scoring.
Yes. You're trying to keep a smooth growth curve in that you don't see these big growth spurts, and you don't see the growth spurts. You don't see these times of the baby gets a little fat, then the baby's ribs are hanging out. Then he gets a little fat, and his ribs are hanging out. Yeah. You try to maintain that body condition score, and if you see that the baby is hitting a growth spurt and you see a little bit more rib, then you adjust the feeding, and you may give them a few more groceries in a balanced way.
And not in a dramatic way.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, and the last one is, do pony foals need moderate NSC?
Excuse me. Basically, I pretty much treat pony foals the way I treat horse foals. Yeah. They're just smaller growing machines.
Yeah. Unless there's like you said, unless there's a metabolic condition with the mare, and that there might be a genetic factor going on.
Yeah. And I actually, I worked on a feed for miniature horses and ponies. And I put together this massive feeding chart based on the mature weight of that growing mini and baby. And it was still used all the same equations that I use for full-size horses. It's now, yes, indeed, ponies and miniatures often are easier keepers. Yeah. And so if that is the case, you adjust just the same way you would with an easy keeper full-size horse.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's it for the questions. That was a great webinar. And cool. I'm sure everybody knows by now that they will be sent the recorded version, and then they're available on our YouTube channel after that, so people can go back and watch it again if you missed something. So fantastic. I'm going to say goodnight to everyone, and a big thank you for attending. And we'll hopefully see you next month at the next one. And the next one is on performance nutrition.
Sounds great.
Yes.
Thank you.